I'm Kitty Prentice and welcome to Māori Minds, where I explore Māori philosophy and mental health and find new ways of applying traditional knowledge. Today I've come to Muriwai Beach and Māori Bay on the west coast of Tamaki Makaurau because I just needed to get out of the house. And this video actually is the first in the series titled Uncovering Māori Philosophy. I've divided this video into two. The first part I ask the question why the health system is failing to improve the health of Māori. In the second part I look more at Māori philosophy. And I've also divided it into chapters or timestamps, so if you look in the description you can see what the headings are, and if you want you can jump ahead to the topics that interest you the most. In the New Zealand media you'll hear comments about the New Zealand health system failing Māori. Inevitably that goes on to conversations about equity, inclusion, diversity, institutional racism, unconscious bias, te tiriti or waitangi, and the negative impact of colonisation on Māori. A deeper examination of the nexus between those issues and the poor health status of Māori may involve the links between land confiscations and early economic and political disadvantage in Māori, and that being compounded over generations. How the prohibition of cultural practices and the speaking of te reo Māori alienated Māori from their culture, which in effect deprived them of access to their traditional cultural practices, which were a very effective means of supporting the health and well-being of people. How the collective psyche of Māori was impacted by racism and racial stereotypes.
Drink! It's always your answer, eh, Jake? Violence.
And what about unconscious bias? Now, I haven't met a health worker who doesn't passionately care about other people and hold very egalitarian values, and yet Māori don't get offered the same gold standard treatments as their non-Māori counterparts. And in mental health, Māori are more likely to be treated with more coercive practices. So that means being injected with injectable antipsychotics, being secluded, hospitalised and treated subject to the Mental Health Act. Can all of that really be attributed to the social determinants of health? Can we really ignore the unconscious bias and structural or institutional racism? Is this an issue of poor change management, good ideas that haven't been successfully implemented? You know, I think back over how successive governments have produced some really great strategic documents for the health sector, the Blueprint 1 and 2 and He Korowai Oranga. But how often have health services actually been successful in implementing the vision and values of those strategic documents? Is the distance between those high-level national strategic documents and national KPIs and the ground-level service delivery too vast a gap to bridge? If that's the case, then maybe the problem is inadequate organisational infrastructure and leadership to transmit those high-level strategies and key performance indicators down to the ground level. Or inadequate resource allocation to train and empower the health workforce to be able to implement those changes. If the issue was simply one of workforce development, then why haven't we done it? Is the problem more about a conflict of two worldviews, Māori and Pākehā? The Western medical model being too narrow in its focus, too biological, not holistic enough? Could the problem simply be solved by adopting a Māori approach? For Māori, by Māori, a kaupapa Māori approach, and the adoption of Māori health models? Well, that makes me think about the Whare Tapa Whā model by Mason Dury, a model that's been around for decades and it's beautifully simple and understandable. So it uses the metaphor of a house with four walls. So you've got the taha wairua, the spiritual side, the taha tinana, the physical side, the taha hinengaro, the mental health side, and the taha whānau, the family side. Let me ask you this, what is wairua? The translation for the Holy Spirit in the Bible is wairua tapu. So does that mean that wairua is synonymous with the Western philosophical world's view of spirit? Whose definition of spirit? Whose definition of wairua? And when DHBs look at their KPI scorecards and look at the metrics and outcomes that help inform them of their performance, do they have a KPI for wairua? How do you hold agencies accountable to delivering services to Māori, for instance, when you don't have Māori metrics? Okay, I'm being a little bit facetious here, and I'm throwing out a whole lot of problems and questions and not so many solutions. And the point I'm getting to is the problem is really complex. There are no simple remedies or quick fixes. Are health services based on Māori philosophy more appealing, effective and appropriate for Māori? Let's examine the challenge of integrating Māori philosophy into the health system. I thought I'd give you an example. A friend of mine asked what the Māori word for recovery was. Now the assumption there was that there's an equivalent Māori concept for recovery. One dictionary definition of the word for recovery is Whakamāui. What does Whakamāui mean? To act like Māui? Well, I did a little bit of research and I came across this expression, mana anō e Whakamāui ake, and that means to rally or recover like Māui did. And the story it was referring to was unfamiliar to me, and that was that Māui was actually killed by Hine Nui Te Pō, and then his spirit re-entered his body and he was reanimated and resurrected. The version of that traditional story that I knew of was that famous story about how Maui, the Polynesian hero who was trying to achieve immortality like all good archetypal heroes do, and he did that by transforming himself into a worm and trying to crawl into the womb of Hine Nui Te Pō. And so a piwai Waka, a fantail, saw him and thought it was hilarious and started chirping and laughing and woke up Hine Nui Te Pō as he was trying to enter her, and she slammed her legs shut and crushed him. And so his blood actually went on to become the first menstruation. So Maui was unsuccessful in reversing the birth-death cycle, but in a way he was immortalized because he now represents menstruation, which is the monthly renewing of the life-giving lining of the womb, the whare tangata. That's the house of man. Okay, so I've gone off on a tangent from recovery to Whakamāui to the resurrection of Maui and menstruation, and I still don't know whether that term Whakamāui can be appropriately used to refer to the recovery from a broken limb, recovery from depression, or recovery from addiction. In this case, the understanding of Whakamāui is predicated on the assumption that people are familiar with concepts like kōrero pūrākau, those traditional Māori stories that transmit not only knowledge but wisdom, and concepts like wairua and mana, and of course a familiarity with the demigod Maui and his adventures. So you can imagine how involved a truly co-designed process with Māori must be. So here's a final big example. Imagine a group of dedicated professionals, both Māori and non-Māori, and whānau and consumer representatives, and they're all engaged in a co-design process to develop a new health service. That same group of people decide that they want to develop a service that's based on the recovery model. So do they start with the Western health concept of recovery and then adapt it to suit Māori from there? So translate recovery to Whakamāui and add in some other Māori terminology, some Māori designs, maybe gift the service with a Māori name and that sort of thing. I'd describe that sort of approach as an adapted Māori approach, ama, and the metaphor that I use for that is a Waka ama. So in this case, the central or main hull is the Western health concept of recovery, and in my mind I imagine that to be like a fiberglass hull, and attached to that is the skinny little ama, so that outrigger that shores up and stabilises the vessel and makes it more seaworthy and appropriate to Māori. If a service is developed using this ama approach, is it truly aligning with te tiriti or waitangi and Māori self-determination? So an alternative approach is what we hear about all the time, the gold standard, and that is a kaupapa Māori approach. So that's when a predominantly Māori workforce use Māori methods and Māori design to come up with the service. The goal is to develop a service that is based on Māori philosophy and is tikanga informed, so it's informed by the customary actions that protect the underpinning Māori philosophy. In that case, they may not even mention the word recovery. They may prefer Whakamāui or totally different concepts. What if they're more focused on kotahitanga, that unity and connection and whānau, or the connection and interrelatedness of those core concepts of mana, tapu, noa, Māori, wairua, ihi, wehi, all of that stuff. They may utilise ronga, traditional Māori healing practices, whakatauki, so that's proverbs or sayings, interpret kōrero pūrākau, so those traditional stories, to build narratives, or even kapahaka in their suite of cultural interventions. The metaphor or image that comes to mind for a kaupapa Māori service is the great ocean-going double-hulled waka, the Waka hourua. The sails capture the intangible like wairua. The lashings of the waka are like the bonds of whakawhanaungatanga that keep the people together. So the final approach would be an entirely new construct, so a waka hou, a new waka, where you combine all the best parts of Māori philosophy, Western philosophy, international philosophy into something that's completely new. Waka hou would have mixed materials, mixed construction methods, mixed design and a mixed crew. Now that waka metaphor is commonly used for any services, particularly house services, because it's a nice image of a waka that carries people on their journey to recovery and wellness. So that's why the whakatauki, or the saying he waka eke noa, we're all in the same boat, is so popular. The waka ama, the waka hourua and the waka hou are three metaphors for describing three different approaches to integrating Māori philosophy with house service design. So a decision must be made about which waka is the most appropriate, which waka can actually be delivered. So in practice, I think that the waka ama model is most commonly used. That's the easiest approach. The gold standard, or what we always talk about in the media and in health circles, is a kaupapa Māori approach, so a waka hourua. But that's much more difficult to achieve because it requires a lot of initial investment and resources. A waka hou, or a completely new waka that's mutually constructed, is really just theoretical. I'm not really sure of any services being designed by that method, and I also have questions about whether that approach could adequately align with the principles of te tiriti o Waitangi and Māori self-determination. So that was quite a journey, exploring the problems, solutions and considerations around the issue of the health system failing to significantly improve the health of Māori. We also started looking at Māori philosophy. We looked at the example of Whakamāui, recovery, and three approaches to integrating Māori philosophy with health service design. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section, and let's keep this conversation going. So if you like this video and you like this YouTube channel, please consider subscribing or take a look at my website at maoriminds.com. Ka kite.